The current humanitarian architecture is not entirely fit for purpose because the cross-cutting issues, aside from protection, largely don't have a proper home in the cluster system and as a result are often uncoordinated. This applies to gender, accountability to affected populations, the environment, and protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. In this short video, we'll look at the cross-cutting issues as themes in humanitarian response that don't fit into a box and that can't be addressed separately because they apply to all of us everywhere. So here's the current cluster system structure. And you can see protection's there, and protection involves both targeted action like reunifying families who've been separated in an emergency, replacing civil documentation that's been lost, providing support to survivors of gender-based violence, and so on. And mainstreaming of protection is also important, which means ensuring all the other clusters take protection into account when they do their response. If WASH sets up latrines which are not safe for people to use, if children are bombed at school or other temporary learning spaces, if people passing through checkpoints to reach a food distribution point are arrested, detained and never seen again, then the humanitarian assistance has done more harm than good. So protection is a cross-cutting issue, plus it also has a home in the cluster system. Let's see some cross-cutting issues that don't. Gender. Gender is a social construct that defines the roles of women, girls, men and boys in different social and cultural contexts, as well as what it means to be masculine or feminine, and what traits are valued and behaviour is expected of a girl, a woman, a boy or a man. So that applies across all the clusters. We need to look at whose role is it to collect water or firewood, to cook food or to look after children, or to take that into account if we're designing a response. If we ignore gender, for example by assuming heads of household can all work locally to earn money for rent and food, then many people may miss out. Maybe the head of the household is elderly or injured or has a disability. Or maybe it's a child that's the head of household. Maybe it's a widow who was married since she was 12, didn't finish school, can't read or write or count, has never worked before, and is simultaneously trying to look after children and sick family members, as well as needing to somehow cover rent and food in a place where even if she wanted to work, because of gender inequality, no one would give her a job. So the principle of impartiality, for that to apply, it's essential to understand these gender differences and target those most in need. Not everyone has the skills to conduct a gender analysis, and it can be helpful to have a coordinated analysis and advice across the operation. It can be helpful for gender to have a home in the cluster system. Next, accountability to affected populations, or AAP, under which people have the right to participate in decisions that affect their lives, to be informed about the assistance that is available, who is eligible, how to get it, what to do if you want to give feedback or make a complaint. All the clusters have to think about this, and so affected people are bombarded with information from different sources, not all of which makes sense to them because of language or literacy or the messaging in the context. They're also confused by multitudes of hotlines and other complaint mechanisms, some of which are only available to people who have a phone and credit to use it. It makes sense to coordinate the activity in this area, starting with a common communications analysis to understand how different groups in the affected community access information, what sources do they trust, and so on, and then designing joint messaging and common mechanisms. And part of AAP is protecting people from our own actions, including conduct that involves sexual exploitation or abuse of the people we are there to serve. Protection from sexual exploitation and abuse, or PSEA, is a requirement that applies to all responders in all clusters. It is cross-cutting. The risks and opportunities for this misconduct differ by cluster. Maybe a sanitation engineer is moving alone amongst a displaced population living in makeshift shelters. Maybe a nutrition worker is consulting lactating women with their children behind a curtain in a clinic. Maybe someone distributing cash or food is in a position to offer someone a little more if they do a favour. To stop it, we need responders to know it's not on, We need communities to know they don't have to put up with it and how to complain if it does happen. And we need to make sure that perpetrators are disciplined and prevented from doing it again. All of that requires coordination, and there needs to be a home in the cluster system. The environment, not yet on the main radar of humanitarian response, but important to mention here. The actions of humanitarian response can have a great impact on the local environment, and this applies across all clusters. The location of a refugee camp, whether the activities disturb the water table underneath, if the local forests are cut down for fuel, if assistance is coming in plastic packages in a place with no solid waste recycling, and so on. It applies across all clusters, and if it's not consciously considered, in emergencies it's easily overlooked. So let's go back to that cluster diagram. Where do these cross-cutting issues fit in? Protection has a home, and because of the recognised centrality of protection in all clusters, there's a Protection Standby Capacity Project, or ProCap, since 2005, which deploys senior advisors to support overall strategic response to displaced and vulnerable people. So they could sit in the middle there with the Humanitarian and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Same with gender. Even though it's homeless, there is a Gender Standby Capacity Project, or GenCap, since 2007, which can enable a gender specialist to lead through the Humanitarian Coordinator's Office, or OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And also sometimes a retrofit is that UN Women or another agency will establish a separate group on gender in humanitarian action. And then that group has to invite along the coordinators from the different clusters, has to push for a spot on the agenda in an intercluster meeting, a place at the table, a section in the humanitarian response plan, and an avenue for funding support for those activities. What about AAP? Well, you can see there that there's an emergency telecommunications cluster, but that focus is more on communications for the humanitarian community. There is now a Services for Communities component, which means that the cluster can provide solutions such as hotlines and so on, but itself it's not responsible for AAP. There have been retrofit efforts. For example, there's Communicating with Disaster Affected Communities network, and more recently there's a Communications and Community Engagement Initiative. And in many of the emergency contexts, there is a Communicating with Communities working group that's established, but it still doesn't have a home. They still have to push for a spot on the agenda, a place at the table, a section in the humanitarian response plan, and funding support. It's little wonder why we don't have a fast and coherent coordinated system for communicating with people about the assistance that may be available for them and how to get it, and an avenue for their right to give us feedback and to make a complaint if we get it wrong. PSEA, again, doesn't have a particular home. In some places, there will be an establishment of a PSEA in-country network, which is actually a responsibility of every humanitarian coordinator, but it doesn't always happen. It is sporadic. And the same basic discussions take place over and over again as to requiring the code of conduct, having communications to the affected people about it, and tightening up the standard operating procedures for complaints. Not ideal. So, what's the solution? Well, I know it's difficult to create new clusters in the system, that would require the Interagency Standing Committee to go and look again and see what needs to happen. And if you open that up, I'm sure then many people would think that it will create the opening of a Pandora's box. The retrofit solution at the moment would be simply to create subclusters to protection, to have not only the existing subcluster on children, gender-based violence, but to also have a regular subcluster on gender, on AAP and on PSEA, and for the main cluster to also cover environmental protection. It's true the current humanitarian architecture is not entirely fit for purpose, but there is a solution. It's 2018, it's time.